My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the steady one, the dependable daughter, the organized project manager, the woman who remembers birthdays, keeps folders labeled, and never raises her voice in a room where other people are losing control. If you met me at a dinner party, you'd probably describe me as composed, polite, thoughtful, maybe even a little reserved. I've been told I have calm eyes, the kind that listen more than they speak. What people don't see is that calm doesn't mean passive, and silence doesn't mean I don't notice. For 30 years, I believed I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. I believed I understood my family's history, the sacrifices, the hardships, the love that shaped me. I believed I understood my father. He was the man I cared for when his blood pressure spiked, the one I drove to specialist appointments, the one whose medications I sorted into weekly containers, the man I defended when relatives criticized his stubbornness, the man who signed my school forms and taught me how to drive, even if he wasn't particularly patient about it. I never questioned that bond until I did something small, quiet, almost forgettable. I secretly took a DNA test, the kind people order out of curiosity, the kind you spit into a tube and mail away without ceremony. I told myself it was for health information, family ancestry, a harmless interest in genealogy. I wasn't prepared for what came back. The results didn't just shift a detail in my family tree, they erased an entire branch. According to science, impartial, unemotional science, the man I had cared for as my father for 3 decades was not biologically related to me at all. There are moments in life that feel loud, explosive, obvious. This wasn't one of them. This was quiet. It was the kind of revelation that doesn't shatter glass. It rearranges gravity. Nothing falls immediately, but nothing stands the same way again either. In this story, I won't scream. I won't dramatize. There's no revenge plot waiting at the end. What happened after that test wasn't chaos. It was something slower, more deliberate. It became a lesson in identity, in loyalty, in the roles families assign us without asking. It became a lesson in quiet dominance. Because when you discover that your origin story isn't what you believed, you have choices. You can explode, you can collapse, or you can observe. I chose to observe. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you what it feels like to question your own reflection, to realize the man you protected might not be who you thought, and that the truth was hidden in plain sight for decades. Not every betrayal is loud. Not every revelation demands confrontation. Sometimes, the deepest shifts happen in silence. And sometimes, the strongest position isn't the one where you demand answers. It's the one where you already have them. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. If the foundation of your identity shifted overnight, would you want the truth immediately? Or would you hesitate before opening that door? For most of my life, I was the responsible one, not the dramatic one, not the fragile one, not the favorite, just the steady one. In my family, that role carried weight, but not visibility. I was the person people relied on without ever fully seeing. If something needed organizing, I did it. If someone forgot a date, I remembered. If emotions flared, I absorbed the tension like insulation inside a wall, necessary but invisible. My father used to joke that I was born 40 years old. He'd say it with a laugh when I reminded him about appointments or corrected a bill he overlooked. You worry too much, Evie. he'd tell me, shaking his head as if I carried a seriousness that didn't belong to someone my age. But he let me do the worrying anyway. By the time I was 16, I was managing parts of the household that most teenagers never thought about. I tracked grocery budgets in a notebook. I helped my mother draft emails. I handled phone calls when service providers tried to overcharge us. It wasn't that my parents were incapable. It was that they trusted me to handle things. And trust can look a lot like assignment. Extended family saw me as dependable. Teachers described me as mature. Friends leaned on me during breakups because I knew how to sit quietly without turning someone else's pain into my own performance. I wore competence like armor. What I didn't realize at the time was how easily competence becomes expectation. When my father developed heart complications in his early 60s, I didn't hesitate. I rearranged my work schedule. I accompanied him to cardiology consultations. I asked questions he wouldn't think to ask. I learned the language of blood pressure, cholesterol ratios, medication interactions. He would wave dismissively when doctors addressed me instead of him. "She's just my daughter," he'd say, half proud, half embarrassed. But they kept looking at me when they needed someone precise. I told myself this was love, that caregiving was simply what daughters do. I never questioned why my older brother wasn't expected to do the same. He lived 2 states away. He had a lot on his plate. That phrase followed him like a protective shield. I had a lot on my plate too, but I didn't say that out loud. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like reliability. People assume you'll handle it. They assume you won't break. They assume you don't need reassurance because you appear self sufficient. I rarely asked for anything, and because I rarely asked, no one thought to offer. Family gatherings followed a pattern. I arrived early, helped set up, stayed late to clean. My father would sit at the head of the table, telling stories from decades ago. I'd refill his water before he asked, adjust the thermostat when he mentioned the room felt cold. He would thank me in passing. But gratitude is different from recognition. Recognition sees effort. Gratitude simply benefits from it. To outsiders, our relationship looked solid. Devoted daughter, proud father. There were no dramatic arguments, no public tension. If anything, we appeared quietly stable, and that stability became my identity. At work, I built a career around the same traits: risk mitigation, contingency planning, data review. I was the one who caught inconsistencies before they became crises. My supervisors valued me. Promotions came steadily, though never flamboyantly. I didn't demand attention. I earned respect. And in my personal life, I followed the same script: long-term relationships, where I was the emotional anchor, the listener, the fixer. Looking back now, I see something I couldn't name back then. I was most comfortable being needed. Being chosen for love felt uncertain, but being relied on felt secure. So when it came to my father, I never asked deeper questions. I never wondered why our emotional conversations felt slightly restrained, why compliments from him sounded measured, almost careful. I assumed that was simply his personality. Some men aren't expressive. Some fathers show love through provision, not vulnerability. That's what I told myself. For 30 years, I believed I understood the dynamics of my family. I believed my role was natural, earned, deserved. I believed the quiet distance between my father and me was just generational. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my entire sense of belonging was resting on something no one had ever confirmed out loud. And when you build an identity around being reliable, you don't think to verify the foundation. You simply maintain it. Tell me something. Have you ever played a role for so long that it stopped feeling like a choice? The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no confession waiting behind it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember the month because I had just finished reorganizing my father's medication schedule after his cardiologist adjusted 2 dosages. I'd driven him to the appointment, taken notes in a small leather notebook, and later stopped by the pharmacy before heading back to my apartment. That evening, my brother Daniel called. He didn't usually call me directly about Dad. He preferred to speak to Mom and then relay information as if he was stepping into a managerial role from a distance. But that night, he called me. "Hey," he said, casual. "Mom mentioned Dad's numbers were off again." "They're stabilizing," I replied. "The doctor just changed the beta blocker. I've updated everything." There was a pause. "You've updated everything?" "Yes. I have his lab reports, the new prescription schedule, and I set reminders on his phone." Another pause. Slightly longer. Then he laughed. Not unkindly, but lightly dismissive. "You don't have to take on all of that, Ev. I mean, it's not like it's your responsibility. It's not like it's your responsibility." The sentence landed strangely. I'd been handling Dad's medical logistics for almost 2 years at that point. No one had objected before. In fact, everyone seemed relieved that I was doing it. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "I just mean," he continued, "you get so intense about this stuff. It's like you're trying to prove something." The words were said casually, almost teasingly. But they stayed. "Trying to prove something." "To who?" I asked. "I don't know. To Dad, maybe." He said it with a shrug I could hear through the phone. I laughed softly, deflecting. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I just want him healthy." "Sure," Daniel said. "I just don't want you to burn out over something that isn't entirely on you." Something that isn't entirely on you. I told myself he meant well. That he was trying, awkwardly, to protect me from overextending myself. That siblings sometimes fumble their words. But when I hung up, I didn't feel protected. I felt displaced, as if I'd been occupying a position that wasn't fully mine. The next small cut came a few weeks later. We were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. My father was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter while I checked the sodium content on a soup label before reheating it. "You don't have to police everything," he said suddenly. I looked up. "I'm not policing, just checking." He sighed, not annoyed, but tired. "Daniel says you've been hovering." Hovering. That word stung more than I expected. I wasn't hovering. I was coordinating appointments, monitoring symptoms, keeping track of refill dates. I was being responsible. But suddenly, responsibility was reframed as intrusion. "I'm just trying to make sure nothing slips," I replied carefully. He nodded, but there was distance in his eyes. "I appreciate it," he said. "I do, but I don't need you worrying like this. You're not obligated." Not obligated. It was subtle. So subtle that anyone else in the room would have missed it. But I heard it. I heard the boundary being drawn, not around behavior, but around belonging. "You're not obligated," as if my devotion was optional, as if my involvement was excessive, as if my investment needed justification. That night, lying in bed, I replayed both conversations. Daniel's, trying to prove something. Dad's, not obligated. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't quite name. Why would caring deeply need explanation? Why would involvement require defense? And beneath those questions was a quieter one I didn't dare articulate yet. Why did they speak to me as if I was slightly outside the core? I pushed the thought away. Families have dynamics. Siblings misinterpret each other. Fathers resist vulnerability. I told myself I was being sensitive. Still, I began noticing small things. At appointments, Dad started answering questions before I could clarify them. When I offered to schedule follow ups, he'd say, I'll check with your mother. Not with you, with your mother. The shift was barely perceptible, but it was there. And once you notice a shift, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront anyone. That wasn't my style. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I adjusted. I became slightly less proactive, waited to be asked, stepped back half a pace. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, something had been marked, a thin line across glass, not shattered, just scored. Have you ever experienced a moment so small that no one else remembers it? But it quietly changed how you see everything afterward. After that Tuesday call and the Sunday dinner that followed, I told myself something simple: don't overreact. It became a quiet mantra. Families say things imperfectly. Brothers speak without thinking. Fathers resist feeling dependent. None of this meant anything deeper. None of it required investigation. So I normalized it. When Daniel made another offhand remark a month later, you always get weirdly intense about dad's stuff. I smiled and let it slide. When my father cancelled an appointment I had carefully arranged and told me afterward, instead of before, I told myself he was asserting independence. When my mother said, you know how your brother worries differently, as if my worry was somehow excessive or misplaced, I nodded. Everyone had their style. I adjusted mine. But here's what no one talks about. When you normalize small dismissals, you start negotiating with your own perception. You begin asking yourself if you're too sensitive, too involved, too attached. And because I prided myself on being rational, I needed logical explanations. Maybe I was compensating. Maybe I did need to prove something. Maybe I was over identifying with the caretaker role. I built arguments against my own instincts. At work, if someone questioned my analysis, I could present data. At home, there were no spreadsheets for emotional nuance, only tone. And tone is slippery. One evening, we were all sitting in the living room after dinner. The television was on low volume. My father was recounting a story from his 20s, a version I'd heard many times. He described how Daniel had been just like him as a child, stubborn, strong willed. Same fire, he said, smiling. Then he glanced at me. And Evelyn, well, she's always been more like her mother, quiet, careful. It was meant as observation, not critique. But something about the phrasing felt deliberate, more like her mother. I looked at my mom instinctively. She smiled softly, unaware of the weight I'd just assigned to a simple sentence. I had his last name, his features, or so I believed. The same dark hair, the same narrow nose. Growing up, relatives would say, she has your eyes. Hadn't they? Or had I just absorbed what I wanted to hear? I dismissed the thought as absurd. Still, the categorizing continued. When family friends visited, Dad would introduce Daniel with pride. My son, the entrepreneur. Even though Daniel's business was still unstable. With me, it was always, this is Evelyn. She keeps us all organized, functional, useful, reliable. I told myself there was dignity in that. But over time, something subtle shifted inside me. I began noticing how often I was thanked for effort, but excluded from intimacy. I knew his medication schedule better than anyone. But when conversations turned personal, memories from his childhood, stories about his own father, he'd drift into a tone reserved for Daniel, as if sharing lineage. as if speaking to continuity. And I would sit there, present but peripheral. I rationalized everything. Some fathers connect more easily with sons. Some bonds are built around shared temperament. Some daughters are simply more self sufficient. But the rationalizations began costing me energy because each time I minimized a small sting, I absorbed it instead. And absorption has a limit. The most disorienting part wasn't the comments themselves, it was the growing awareness that I was trying harder, trying to be lighter, less intense, less hovering. I stopped double checking his prescriptions unless he asked. I reduced my visits from twice a week to once. I told myself space would restore balance. Instead, something else happened. The less I leaned in, the less I was referenced. Daniel began speaking about decisions as if he were primary contact. My father would say, Daniel and I talked. Even when I had provided the information behind that discussion, I wasn't erased, but I was repositioned. And because there was no open conflict, no explicit rejection, I couldn't justify confronting it. So I did what I'd always done. I optimized my usefulness. If emotional access wasn't expanding, I would excel in logistics. If intimacy felt gated, I would strengthen structure. It sounds clinical now, but at the time, it felt like loyalty. Until one evening, alone in my apartment, I caught myself thinking something that startled me. If I disappeared from this dynamic, would anything fundamentally change? That thought wasn't self pitying, it was analytical, a systems question. And once you start analyzing a system, you can't stop noticing patterns. Have you ever quietly adjusted yourself in order to stay connected, only to realize you were the only one adjusting? There's a moment in every long standing dynamic when you realize you're not just participating in a role, you're maintaining it. For me, that realization didn't arrive as anger, it arrived as clarity. I was the stabilizer, the quiet infrastructure, the one who ensured the machine kept running while everyone else debated direction. And the unsettling part wasn't that I had taken on that role, it was that everyone seemed comfortable leaving me there. It happened during a family meeting that no one officially called a meeting. Dad's cardiologist had suggested a minor procedure, routine, low risk, preventative. Still, it required scheduling, insurance approvals, post op monitoring. Naturally, I began outlining a timeline. I can take the first week off work, I said calmly. I'll coordinate with the insurance company tomorrow. We should also check whether the secondary policy covers post surgical therapy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. See? He said lightly, glancing at our parents. She's already building a spreadsheet. There was laughter, gentle, harmless, but something in his tone carried implication, as if I were overstepping a boundary no one had formally drawn. My father cleared his throat. Evie, he said carefully, you don't have to run this. I paused. I'm not running it, I replied evenly. I'm organizing it. Daniel shrugged. Mom can handle the scheduling. My mother looked slightly overwhelmed, but nodded automatically. And that's when I saw it. The invisible script. Daniel positioned himself as advisor, strategic voice, son. My mother as emotional support, wife, and me, logistics, execution, backup. I wasn't being excluded. I was being assigned to the least visible part of responsibility. I studied the dynamic quietly over the next few weeks. When financial discussions came up, Daniel's opinions were solicited first, even though I had more stable income and actual budgeting experience. When health decisions were mentioned, I was updated, but not consulted unless practical tasks were involved. If something needed doing, I was included. If something required acknowledgement of emotional significance, I was peripheral. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it harder to confront. No one was cruel. No one raised their voice. But I began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Conditional belonging. As long as I was useful, I was central. When usefulness wasn't required, I faded. I tested it once, intentionally. When Dad mentioned he needed to reschedule a follow up, I didn't offer to call. I simply said, "Let me know what day you choose." Silence stretched. My mother looked at me expectantly. Daniel waited. Dad frowned slightly. "You're not going to check availability?" he asked. "I can," I replied calmly. "But you sounded like you had it covered." He hesitated, then sighed. "Well, you usually handle it." There it was, not a request, an expectation, and beneath it, something subtler. "You're responsible for this, because that's what you are. Not because we asked, because you always do." I drove home that night with unusual stillness. I wasn't hurt, I was evaluating. I had built my identity around being indispensable, but indispensability isn't the same as intimacy. And I began to question something far more foundational than scheduling or tone. If my primary value in this family was operational, what did that say about my place in its emotional core? That question didn't feel dramatic. It felt destabilizing. Because roles, once accepted, become self reinforcing. You behave according to them, others respond accordingly, and eventually the role feels like personality. But what if it wasn't personality? What if it was adaptation? That night, I opened my laptop, not to manage appointments, but to search something else entirely. Not yet the DNA test, not yet that door, just ancestry articles, genetic inheritance patterns, how traits skip generations. It was casual curiosity. At least, that's what I told myself. But somewhere beneath the rational tone of research, another thought had begun forming. If I don't feel fully rooted here, is it possible I'm not? I didn't say it out loud. I barely let it finish in my own mind. But once the question exists, it doesn't disappear. It waits. Tell me, have you ever realized the role you were praised for might also be the cage you never noticed? The day everything shifted didn't look extraordinary. No arguments, no revelations, no dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. I had taken a half day off work to accompany my father to another routine cardiology appointment. By then, I had stepped back from managing everything. I only attended when explicitly asked. That morning, he had called. "Your mother's busy," he said. "Can you come?" Of course I could. In the waiting room, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. I sat beside him, hands folded loosely in my lap. I had brought a notebook out of habit, but I didn't open it. The nurse called his name. Inside the exam room, the doctor reviewed test results. Stable, manageable. Continue current regimen. When the doctor asked if there were questions, I glanced at my father first. He shook his head. I stayed silent. The appointment ended quickly. As we walked back to the car, he seemed distracted. Halfway across the parking lot, he said something that wasn't meant to wound, but it did. "You know," he began casually, unlocking the car, "Daniel's been asking more about my health lately." "That's good," I said. "He worries," my father continued. "He feels responsible." Responsible. The word settled heavily. I kept my voice even. "I'm glad he's checking in." He nodded. "It's different with sons. They carry things differently." Different with sons. The statement wasn't confrontational. It wasn't even exclusionary on the surface. But something inside me went very still. For years, I had structured my schedule around his care. I had memorized medication names most people can't pronounce. I had rearranged meetings, postponed vacations, adjusted my own life rhythm. And yet, responsibility was being attributed elsewhere, not maliciously, just naturally, as if it belonged there more. We drove home in near silence. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel rejected. I felt displaced, like furniture subtly shifted in a room you've known your entire life. When I dropped him off, he patted my shoulder gently. Thanks, kid, he said. Kid, 36 years old, still slightly outside the inner circle of shared gravity. I drove back to my apartment and sat in my car longer than usual. That's when the shift happened. Not outwardly, internally. For the first time, I stopped asking how to be more effective. I started asking a different question. What if this dynamic isn't something I need to improve? What if it's something I need to understand? The difference is subtle. Improvement assumes you belong and must optimize. Understanding allows for the possibility that something fundamental is misaligned. That evening, I opened my laptop again. The ancestry research I had skimmed weeks earlier resurfaced in my browser history. Genetic inheritance patterns, non paternity events, unexpected DNA discoveries. I read clinically, statistics, case studies, emotional impact reports. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was curiosity sharpened by quiet displacement. I thought about the phrases that had echoed over the past year. You're not obligated, trying to prove something, different with sons, individually harmless, together, curious. I studied childhood photos that night. Me at 5 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders. Me at 10, standing beside him at a school recital. We looked alike. Or did we? Memory is persuasive, and resemblance is often suggested into existence. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar. Detachment, not from him, from assumption. For the first time in my life, I allowed a possibility to surface without immediately rejecting it. What if the distance I've always felt isn't personality? What if it's information? The thought didn't devastate me. It clarified something that had been blurry for years. And here's the most surprising part. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt calm. Because if there was something hidden in my foundation, I would rather know it quietly than continue compensating for something I couldn't name. That was the day silence stopped being adaptation and started becoming strategy. Not strategy against anyone, strategy for myself. Tell me, have you ever reached a moment where instead of defending a relationship, you began investigating it? After that Thursday, I stopped reacting. Not externally, I had already mastered that. Internally, there's a difference between absorbing tension and observing it. For most of my life, I absorbed, I carried, I compensated. Now I watched. The shift was subtle enough that no one noticed. When my father mentioned that Daniel had strong instincts, just like me, I didn't analyze the phrasing. I logged it. When my mother said, "You've always been so independent, Evelyn," I didn't interpret it as praise or distance. I catalogued it. I began noticing patterns the way I would during a professional audit. Language patterns, emotional emphasis, points of alignment. It wasn't cold, it was clarifying. And here's what surprised me. Once I stopped trying to secure my position in the family, I felt lighter. For years, I had quietly leaned forward in conversations, offering support, filling silence, smoothing friction. Now I leaned back. If something needed organizing, I waited to be asked. If decisions were discussed without me, I didn't insert myself. Silence became deliberate. Daniel mistook it for retreat. One evening during a group call, he said, "You've been quiet lately, Ev. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I replied. And it was. Because I was no longer trying to maintain something that might not have been mine to maintain. At first, my parents seemed relieved by my reduced intensity. My father joked, "You're finally relaxing." But after a few weeks, the system adjusted. Appointments weren't scheduled as efficiently. Medication refills were delayed. Small logistical errors accumulated. And instead of stepping in automatically, I watched, not to punish, to understand. Who would fill the gap if I didn't? The answer was slower than I expected. My mother tried. She became visibly more tired. Daniel offered advice, but rarely executed. Eventually, my father called me one afternoon. "Did we miss a refill?" he asked. "You might have," I said gently. "What does the bottle say?" There was a pause. "I thought you were tracking it." "I was," I replied. "But you mentioned wanting more independence." Silence, not hostile, just recalibrating. "I suppose I did," he said quietly. That conversation revealed something important. My role hadn't just been assumed, it had been relied upon. And when I stepped back, the vacuum became visible. But here's what mattered more. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to fill it. I wasn't proving devotion through efficiency. I was allowing the dynamic to reveal itself. And beneath the surface, another preparation was taking place. I ordered the DNA kit on a Sunday night. No announcement, no dramatic music playing in the background. Just a quiet decision. I told myself it was for health mapping, for ancestry data, for curiosity. But if I'm honest, it was something else. It was control, not over them, over information. If there was a truth beneath the emotional static, I wanted to see it clearly, without confrontation, without speculation. When the small white box arrived in the mail, I placed it on my kitchen counter and didn't open it immediately. I let it sit there for 2 days. I cooked dinner beside it, answered work emails beside it, walked past it without touching it. Because once opened, there would be no unknowing. Silence had given me perspective. Now it was offering me a threshold. And what struck me most was this. I wasn't afraid of losing my father. I was afraid of continuing a dynamic built on something unspoken. There's a particular kind of strength that comes from restraint. Not the restraint of suppression, but the restraint of patience. No accusations, no emotional eruptions, no rushed conclusions. Just evidence. The night I finally opened the box, I felt calm, almost clinical, as if I were initiating a study. But beneath that composure was something deeper. If the foundation is solid, this changes nothing. If it isn't, I deserve to know. Tell me. When faced with a quiet doubt that refuses to disappear, do you confront it immediately, or do you prepare first? Once the DNA kit was in my apartment, unopened but present, something in me sharpened. Not paranoia, precision. For most of my life, I had moved through my family as participant. Now, without changing my tone or behavior, I shifted into observer. And observers see patterns that participants miss. The first thing I began documenting wasn't medical schedules or insurance details, it was memory. I started writing down small childhood recollections, fragments that had never seemed significant before. Times when relatives commented that I didn't resemble anyone on that side. Moments when distant family members asked, jokingly, "Where did she get that from?" Stories about my birth that were oddly brief compared to Daniel's. It wasn't that there were glaring inconsistencies, it was the absence of depth. Daniel's infancy had stories layered with detail: who he looked like, how he inherited Grandpa's stubborn streak, how he walked early just like Dad. My origin story was simpler. You were such a quiet baby. You slept a lot. You were easy. Functional descriptors. Even my father's affection had always been slightly formal, proud, supportive, but measured. At the time, I interpreted it as personality difference. Now I logged it without judgment. I also began studying timelines, not obsessively, methodically. My birth certificate, their wedding date, hospital records my mother kept in a plastic folder labeled Important Documents. There were no dramatic gaps. But there was something subtle. I was born 8 months and 3 weeks after their wedding. Technically plausible, clinically tight. I didn't draw conclusions. I just noted it. Meanwhile, outwardly, I remained unchanged. Family dinners, calm conversations, light check ins. If anything, I appeared more relaxed than before. Daniel mentioned once, "You've chilled out lately." I smiled. Preparation often looks like peace. The DNA kit sat on my desk for 4 days before I finally completed it. The instructions were simple, clinical, detached. Spit into the tube, seal, register the barcode, mail. It took less than 10 minutes. 30 years of assumed lineage condensed into a vial of saliva. I dropped the package into a blue USPS mailbox on a Wednesday morning before work. No ceremony, no hesitation, just quiet resolve. After that, the waiting began. 4 to 6 weeks, the website said. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not Daniel, certainly not my father. This wasn't about accusation, it was about clarity. During those weeks, something else happened. Without realizing it, I began building independence in ways that extended beyond emotion. I reviewed my financial accounts, updated beneficiaries, checked property records, not because I expected conflict, because I recognized something important. If identity shifts, structure must follow. If the DNA test confirmed what I suspected or disproved it entirely, I wanted to be anchored in my own autonomy. This wasn't revenge preparation, it was sovereignty. And here's what fascinated me most. As I quietly recalibrated my internal foundation, my father began leaning on me again. Small things at first. Can you look over this insurance letter? Does this dosage seem right? I responded evenly, helpfully, but not automatically. There's a difference between offering support and being consumed by it. For the first time, I felt the distinction. One evening, while reviewing a document he had asked me to examine, I studied his signature at the bottom of a form. Our last names matched. Our handwriting rhythms were similar. For a moment, doubt flickered. What if this is all in your head? What if you're manufacturing distance to justify stepping back? That's the thing about quiet preparation. It requires tolerance for uncertainty. No dramatic evidence, no external validation, just patience. Weeks passed. I checked the DNA portal once every few days, processing, analyzing, almost complete. And during that time, I noticed something else they never noticed. The less I emotionally chased belonging, the more stable I felt, as if my center had shifted from family validation to personal truth. I wasn't withdrawing from them, I was relocating within myself. Whatever the results would say, I understood one thing clearly. If biology aligned with belief, nothing needed to change. If it didn't, I would not collapse. Because I had already begun building something independent of lineage. Tell me, when you prepare quietly for the possibility of truth, do you feel stronger or more alone? The email arrived on a Monday morning at 6:12 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was already awake. I had developed the habit of checking the DNA portal before work. Not obsessively, just routinely. A quiet ritual, like checking the weather. But that morning, I didn't have to log in first. The subject line appeared on my phone screen. Your DNA results are ready. I didn't open it immediately. I lay still in bed, phone resting against my palm, staring at the ceiling. There are moments when life divides itself into before and after. But the division isn't loud. It's breath held between two heartbeats. This was one of those moments. I sat up slowly and opened the email. The interface was clean, minimal, clinical. Percentages of ancestry populated first. European regions. Predictable. Unremarkable. Then I navigated to the section labeled DNA relatives. The screen refreshed. A list appeared. Several distant cousins, a few second and third connections. And at the top, a bolded category, parent/child. 50% DNA match. My heart didn't race. It didn't drop. It steadied. I clicked. A name I had never seen before filled the screen. Male. Age 62. Location, Arizona. Not my father. There was no hesitation from the system. No ambiguity. Genetic match probability 99.98%. Relationship. Biological father. I stared at the data for a long time, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. For 30 years, I had built my understanding of belonging around a man who shared my last name, but not my DNA. And the confirmation didn't feel explosive. It felt aligning, like a subtle click inside a mechanism that had always been slightly off. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle. Then I did what I always do. I examined the details. The man's profile included a brief bio, retired engineer, 2 children listed in his family tree, recently active, recently active, which meant he had taken the test voluntarily, which meant he might not know about me, or he might. I didn't assume either. Instead, I studied the shared DNA segments, the technical breakdown, the centimorgans. There was no room for misinterpretation. Science had spoken clearly. The man who raised me, who I drove to appointments, whose prescriptions I memorized, whose health I monitored, was not my biological father. And suddenly, so many small phrases reorganized themselves in my memory. Different with sons. You're not obligated. Trying to prove something. They no longer felt dismissive. They felt informed, as if he had always known a truth I didn't, or suspected one. The thought didn't ignite anger, it deepened the quiet. Because if he knew, then his distance wasn't indifference, it was boundary. And if he didn't know, then the distance was something else entirely. Instinct? Unconscious recognition. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. The world outside my window looked unchanged. Cars moving, neighbors walking dogs, morning light filtering through trees. Nothing had shifted externally, but internally, gravity had adjusted. I touched the silver locket resting against my collarbone, the one I'd worn since childhood. Inside it was a small photo of my parents on their wedding day. For the first time, I wondered what existed just outside the frame of that image. A hidden timeline, a private decision, a silence maintained for decades. I didn't message the man in Arizona. Not yet. I didn't call my mother. I didn't confront my father. Because revelation is not the same as reaction. This information was leverage, not over anyone, but over confusion. I now understood something essential. My lifelong feeling of peripheral belonging had not been imagination. It had been data without context. And context changes everything. I returned to my desk and logged back into the portal. I downloaded the raw DNA file, saved screenshots, archived the confirmation email, not as ammunition, as record. There is a unique calm that comes when doubt transforms into clarity. No celebration, no collapse, just structure. I wasn't devastated. I was reorganized. Tell me, when the truth confirms what you've quietly suspected for years, does it break you? Or does it finally make you steady? The day after I received the results, I went to work as if nothing had happened. I answered emails, led a strategy call, reviewed a budget forecast. My voice was steady, my posture unchanged. No one would have guessed that. Less than 24 hours earlier, my origin story had rewritten itself. That's the thing about quiet revelations. They don't demand performance. They demand decisions. And I had several. Option 1. Confront my mother immediately. Ask direct questions. Demand timelines. Force disclosure. Option 2. Tell my father first. Place the results in front of him and watch his reaction. Option 3. Message the man in Arizona. Open a door to a stranger whose DNA mirrors half of mine. Option 4. Say nothing. Keep the information private. Adjust my understanding internally and let the family dynamic remain undisturbed. Each path carried consequence. Confrontation, would create rupture. Silence would preserve peace, but at the cost of truth. Contacting the biological father would introduce variables I couldn't predict. For 2 days, I didn't choose. I observed. At dinner that Wednesday, my father told a story about Daniel again, how he inherited the Carter stubbornness. I watched his face as he spoke. Pride, familiarity, continuity. Then he glanced at me. And Evelyn, he added, smiling faintly, has always had her own rhythm. Her own rhythm, not ours. The phrasing was gentle, but I heard it differently now. After dinner, my mother handed me a folder. Can you keep this? She asked. You're better at organizing important documents. Inside were insurance policies, bills, property records, trust, responsibility, inheritance logistics. I carried the folder home and laid the documents across my dining table. For the first time, the legal structure of my family felt separate from its biology. Names, signatures, designations. My name appeared as beneficiary in multiple places. Daniel's too. Legally, nothing had changed. Emotionally, everything had. That night, I made tea and sat in silence. I didn't feel rage toward my mother. I didn't feel resentment toward my father. What I felt was something more measured. Autonomy. For 30 years, my loyalty had been instinctive. Now, it would be intentional. The decision point wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about choosing my alignment. I asked myself a single question. If I speak now, what am I seeking? Justice? Acknowledgement? Reassurance? Punishment? None of those felt accurate. What I wanted was clarity without chaos, which meant timing mattered. So I chose something irreversible, but not explosive. I scheduled a one-on-one lunch with my mother. Not urgent, not dramatic, just a quiet calendar invite. Subject line, lunch. If there was a truth hidden in our history, she held it. And I would not enter that conversation emotional or accusatory. I would enter it informed. But before that meeting, there was one more step. I opened the DNA portal again and clicked on the Arizona profile. A message button blinked softly at the top of the screen. Contact. My thumb hovered over the trackpad. This choice would create a parallel narrative, one that could unfold quietly alongside my current life, or collide with it. I thought about identity, not as biology, but as continuity. The man who raised me had shaped my discipline, my ethics, my steadiness. The man in Arizona had shaped my cells. Both mattered, but only one knew me. I closed the message window, not because I was afraid, because I understood sequence. First, truth within my existing foundation, then expansion. I returned to my calendar confirmation for lunch with my mother. 3 days away. Plenty of time to prepare. I wasn't entering that conversation as a wounded daughter. I was entering it as a woman who already knew the answer. Tell me, when you hold information powerful enough to shift a family's reality, do you release it immediately, or do you decide who deserves to hear it first? The 3 days before lunch with my mother were not filled with anxiety. They were structured. I've always believed that clarity deserves preparation. If I was going to open a door that had been closed for 36 years, I would do it deliberately, not emotionally. First, I gathered documentation. I printed the DNA summary page, not the dramatic relative matching screen, just the clinical breakdown showing the 50% parental match. I saved digital backups in 2 secure folders, not because I expected denial, because I respect evidence. Then I reviewed the family documents she had handed me earlier that week. Wills, insurance policies, property deeds. Nothing in them reflected biology. Everything reflected legal intent. That distinction mattered. Whatever truth emerged, my position in the family had been consciously designated, not accidental. That realization softened something inside me. Whether I shared DNA or not, I had been named, chosen, and yet not told. I updated my own estate documents that Thursday afternoon. Small changes. Clarified beneficiaries. Adjusted emergency contacts. Not in reaction, just an acknowledgement that identity shifts ripple outward. If my understanding of lineage was changing, I wanted every structure in my life to reflect conscious choice rather than assumption. No one noticed. At dinner that evening, my father asked if I could look over a new prescription adjustment. I'll take a look tomorrow, I said calmly. No immediate reorganization, no automatic takeover, just measured response. He nodded. Daniel texted in the family group chat about a potential investment opportunity. For the first time, I didn't offer analysis. I read it, observed, stayed neutral. Moving in silence doesn't mean disengaging. It means recalibrating your level of access. On Friday morning, I reviewed my notes from childhood memories one more time, not to confirm suspicion, but to steady my tone. When you enter a conversation holding truth, the other person may not realize you possess. Composure becomes responsibility. I didn't rehearse accusations. I rehearsed questions. Open ended, calm, direct. Is there anything about my birth I should know? Was there ever a reason you hesitated to tell me something? Questions that allowed honesty without cornering. Friday afternoon arrived. Lunch was scheduled at a small cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral territory. I arrived early, ordered water, sat facing the entrance. When my mother walked in, she looked as she always did, gentle, composed, carrying her oversized handbag filled with receipts and folded papers. She smiled warmly when she saw me. There was no tension in her expression, which meant one of two things. She didn't know what I knew, or she had been carrying this quietly for decades. We ordered soup and sandwiches. Small talk filled the first few minutes. Weather, work, Daniel's latest project. Then I placed my hands flat on the table, not dramatically, just to ground myself. Mom, I began softly. I need to ask you something important. Her posture shifted, subtle but immediate. What is it? I held her gaze. Is there anything about my birth that I don't know? Silence settled between us. Not confusion, recognition. Her eyes didn't widen. They didn't search for understanding. They softened. And in that softening, I understood something crucial. This wasn't going to be a discovery for her. It was going to be a reckoning. I didn't reach for the printed DNA report yet. I let the question breathe. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't presenting evidence. It's giving someone the opportunity to speak first. Tell me, when you approach a truth that has been buried for years, is it stronger to arrive with proof or with presence? My mother didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, fingers lightly tracing the edge of her napkin. Then she inhaled slowly. I always wondered when this day would come, she said. Not if. When. The words settled between us like a quiet confession. I didn't interrupt. When you were little, she continued, her voice steady but softer than usual. I told myself it didn't matter, that love would be enough, that biology wouldn't change anything. Biology. She said it without prompting. My heart didn't race. It aligned. So you knew, I said gently. She nodded. Yes. There was no dramatic apology, no tears spilling onto the table, just acknowledgement. Does he know? I asked. She understood who I meant. Another pause. I don't think so, she said carefully. Not with certainty. Not with certainty. That phrasing was precise. He suspected? I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me. There were complications in our marriage before you were born, she said quietly. We worked through them. Your father chose to stay. He chose to raise you as his own. Chose. The word echoed differently than obligation ever had. A subtle rearrangement of the past. For 36 years? I asked. Yes. The cafe noise continued around us. Cups clinking, a door opening and closing, ordinary life unfolding while my foundation shifted quietly. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, not accusing, just seeking sequence. She pressed her lips together briefly. Because we wanted you to feel secure, she said. Because we believed the truth would complicate something that was working. Working. I thought about all the years I had tried to optimize belonging, all the times I absorbed small distances, all the phrases that now made sense in a different light. You let me try to earn something that wasn't biological, I said softly. Her eyes filled, not dramatically but with recognition. You were never earning it, she replied. He loved you. I believed that. But love and knowledge are different currencies. And Daniel? I asked. He doesn't know, she said immediately. That answer felt heavier. So I had been the only one navigating an invisible variable. Not excluded, not included, just uninformed. I reached into my bag and slid the printed DNA summary across the table. I took a test, I said calmly. She looked at it but didn't touch it. I thought you might, she whispered. Again, not surprise. Expectation. That realization carried its own consequence. This truth had been waiting, not avoided, delayed. What happens now? She asked quietly. There it was, the shift. The moment where the dynamic no longer revolved around maintaining stability, but responding to clarity. I'm not here to expose anyone, I said evenly. I'm here because I deserve to understand my own story. She nodded. You do. When we left the cafe, nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred. No shouting, no fractured relationships, but something irreversible had begun. My mother now knew that I knew, and that knowledge would ripple. That evening, my father called, not about medication, not about insurance. His voice was unusually measured. Your mother said you had lunch, he began. Yes. Silence lingered. Then he said something that told me everything I needed to understand about the decades before. I always hoped you wouldn't feel less, he said. Not if you found out. Not if it was true. He spoke from within the truth. I don't, I replied. And in that moment, I meant it. But consequences don't erupt. They unfold. In the days that followed, the family atmosphere shifted in ways too subtle for anyone outside to notice. Daniel sensed tension but couldn't name it. My mother moved more carefully in conversations. My father's tone toward me softened, not out of guilt, but something closer to relief. Because the unspoken was now shared, and once something hidden becomes mutual knowledge, silence changes shape. Tell me, when truth finally surfaces, does it break relationships? Or does it expose the ones that were strong enough to hold it all along? After lunch with my mother, nothing exploded. But everything shifted. There's a misconception that buried truths detonate once exposed. In reality, they leak into daily life, subtly altering tone, posture, timing. The first visible change was in my father. He began calling me more often, not about logistics, about stories. Do you remember when we drove to the coast when you were 8? He asked one evening. I did. You insisted on reading the map, he continued, almost laughing. You wouldn't let me miss a turn. The memory wasn't new. The intention behind sharing it was. He was revisiting history, not to rewrite it, but to reinforce it, as if anchoring moments before they drifted under reinterpretation. I remember, I said gently. Silence lingered. Then he added, I chose that trip because you loved the ocean. Chose. Again. He was telling me something without stating it outright. Daniel, meanwhile, sensed something intangible. At Sunday dinner, he glanced between my parents and me. Did I miss something? He asked casually. No, my mother replied quickly. Too quickly. The word hung in the air. I watched the dynamics carefully. My father's tone toward Daniel remained steady, but something had shifted. A layer of unspoken comparison had dissolved. It wasn't rivalry, it was recalibration. For 36 years, he had carried a quiet tension, knowing a truth he wasn't sure I knew. Now that I did, The performance of normalcy required less effort. One evening, he asked if I could come over alone. No agenda, just tea. We sat in the living room where so many family conversations had unfolded. He didn't look nervous. He looked resolved. I should have told you earlier, he said calmly. Not defensive, not ashamed, just honest. I didn't know how, he continued. And then it felt too late. Too late. That phrase carries weight. There's a point in any long held secret where disclosure feels more disruptive than concealment. I understand, I said. And I did. Because the longer silence lives, the more fragile its container becomes. He studied my face carefully. Are you angry? He asked. No. The answer surprised him. Why not? He asked. I considered that carefully. Because nothing about how you raised me was conditional, I said. The biology changes context. It doesn't erase history. His shoulders lowered slightly, tension releasing. But consequences aren't only emotional, they're structural. The following week, my mother asked if we should update legal documents. Just in case, she said quietly. The implication was clear. If the truth became known beyond this room, if Daniel ever found out, clarity in paperwork might prevent confusion. I nodded. Not because I feared inheritance disputes, but because transparency stabilizes systems. Meanwhile, something else surfaced unexpectedly. I received a notification from the DNA platform. The Arizona match had viewed my profile. No message, just a visit. My pulse remained steady. Parallel realities were beginning to overlap. Inside my family, silence had shifted from concealment to mutual awareness. Outside it, possibility hovered. Nothing could return to its previous state. Not because love had fractured, but because illusion had dissolved. And illusion, once gone, cannot be reconstructed. At dinner the next Sunday, Daniel made a passing joke. You two have been acting weird lately, he said, pointing lightly between my parents and me. My father smiled. Just getting older, he replied. The response was smooth, but Daniel's eyes lingered on me a fraction longer. He sensed misalignment. He just didn't know its source. And that's when I understood something profound. Truth doesn't only change those who know it subtly destabilizes those who don't. Because energy shifts, tone shifts, attention shifts, and even without evidence, people feel it. Nothing could be fixed now, not because something was broken, but because a long-held equilibrium had expired. Tell me, when a secret finally breathes air, is the damage in its existence, or in the years it remained unspoken? I didn't plan to tell Daniel, not immediately, but silence has a way of thinning when too many people are holding it. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. We were all at my parents' house. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was adjusting the thermostat. Daniel and I were clearing plates from the table. He set a dish in the sink and looked at me directly. Okay, he said quietly. What's going on? His tone wasn't accusatory. It was analytical. You've been different, he continued. Dad's been different. Mom looks like she's carrying something. I dried my hands slowly. There are moments when you can deflect, and moments when deflection becomes manipulation. I chose clarity. There's something you don't know, I said evenly. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He waited. I took a DNA test, I continued, and it showed that Dad isn't my biological father. The sentence landed in the room without explosion. Daniel blinked once. That's not funny, he said automatically. I'm not joking. Silence stretched. I didn't rush to fill it. He searched my face for signs of exaggeration, drama, anger. He found none. Does Dad know? He asked. Yes. And Mom? Yes. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms, mirroring the posture he used in strategy discussions. How long? He asked. They've known since before I was born. The information reorganized his understanding in real time. I watched it happen. He glanced toward the living room where our father stood. He's still your dad, Daniel said quietly. I know. You're not upset? No. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Because conflict is easier to respond to than composure. So, what does this mean? He asked. It means my biology is different than we assumed, I said. It doesn't erase how I was raised. He studied me carefully. Are you going to tell people? I already told the only people who needed to know. That included him. He exhaled slowly. You always felt slightly separate, he said before catching himself. He looked surprised by his own admission. How? I asked, not offended, just curious. I don't know, he said honestly. Not in a bad way, just like you operated on a different frequency. Different frequency. The phrasing echoed my father's earlier words, her own rhythm, and in that moment, something aligned without bitterness. They hadn't rejected me. They had sensed difference without understanding it. I nodded. I felt it too, I said calmly. No accusation, just acknowledgement. My father walked back into the kitchen then, sensing the stillness. Daniel looked at him. Is it true? He asked. My father met his eyes. Yes, no hesitation, no defensiveness, just truth. Daniel looked between us again. Why didn't you tell me? He asked them. Because it wasn't yours to carry, my mother said softly from the doorway. That answer quieted him. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with recalibration. Roles shifted subtly in that kitchen, not dramatically, but permanently. For the first time, we were all standing on the same informational ground. No hierarchy of knowledge, no protected illusions, just reality. Daniel stepped toward me and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. You're still my sister, he said. I know, and I believed him, because identity isn't erased by revelation. It's clarified by it. There was no scene, no fracture, just a room adjusting to new gravity. Tell me, when confrontation happens without anger, does it feel weaker? Or does it reveal who was strong enough to handle the truth all along? It has been 8 months since that lunch. 8 months since science rearranged my foundation. 8 months since silence became shared. And here's the part that surprises people when I tell them this story. I don't feel fractured. I feel integrated. For most of my life, I tried to optimize belonging. I adjusted my tone, my effort, my proximity. I leaned into usefulness because usefulness felt measurable. Now, I no longer measure my place in a room by how much I contribute to keeping it stable. I sit differently, not withdrawn, not defensive, just rooted. My father, because he is still my father, speaks to me with less guardedness now. The subtle distance that once felt unexplainable has softened into something honest. We don't pretend, we don't dramatize. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he'll say things like, I'm proud of the woman you've become. Not as reinforcement, as recognition, and there's no longer a silent question beneath it. My mother carries less tension too. The secrecy that once hovered invisibly between us has dissolved. We speak more directly, not about the past constantly, but about everything with more transparency. Daniel and I have found a new equilibrium. There's less subtle comparison, less unconscious sorting. He once told me, you seem more self contained. I took it as a compliment because self contained doesn't mean closed, it means anchored. I did eventually message the man in Arizona. Not impulsively, not dramatically, just a brief introduction. The conversation has been measured, polite, curious. No immediate reunions, no cinematic embraces. Just two adults acknowledging biology without erasing lived history. I'm not searching for replacement, I'm expanding context. That's the distinction. For years, I mistook emotional labor for love. I believed that if I organized enough, supported enough, anticipated enough, I would secure belonging. But belonging that requires performance is unstable. Belonging rooted in truth is quiet. And here's what changed most profoundly. I no longer interpret subtle differences as personal deficiency. If someone feels distant, I don't overcorrect. If I sense misalignment, I don't compensate. I observe, then I decide. The DNA test didn't dismantle my identity. It removed the invisible pressure I had been carrying without knowing why. I was never trying to prove something. I was trying to stabilize something I couldn't see. Now, I don't stabilize what isn't mine to hold. I support when asked. I love intentionally. I step back without guilt. And in doing so, I discovered something that had nothing to do with chromosomes. My strength was never in being indispensable. It was in being composed enough to handle the truth without collapsing under it. When people ask if I wish I had known earlier, I pause because timing shaped my response. At 20, I might have reacted. At 36, I recalibrated. And perhaps that's the quiet dominance no one noticed growing inside me all along. Tell me, if your identity shifted today, would you cling to who you were? Or would you allow yourself to become something steadier? When people hear the title of my story, I secretly took a DNA test and was shocked to discover I'm not biologically related to the father I've cared for 30 years. They expect betrayal. They expect shouting. They expect abandonment. They expect someone to be cast as the villain. But that isn't what happened. A hidden DN. A test shattered 3 decades of belief about who my father really is. And yet, it didn't shatter my life. It clarified it. What I lost wasn't love. It was assumption. What changed wasn't my history. It was my understanding of it. For 36 years, I tried to secure my place in a family dynamic that felt slightly off center. I thought I needed to earn closeness through competence, through responsibility, through being the steady one. But biology wasn't the source of that distance. Silence was. And silence, once illuminated, loses its power. The truth didn't create instability. It removed confusion. My father chose to raise me. My mother chose to protect a version of stability. I chose to uncover the missing piece. No one screamed. No one left. No one was humiliated. Because quiet strength doesn't need spectacle, it needs clarity. Here's what I learned: love is not less real because it isn't genetic. But identity feels more solid when it isn't built on partial information. We often fear that truth will destroy connection. Sometimes it simply refines it. I don't love my father less. I don't resent my mother. I don't see my brother differently, but I see myself more accurately. And that changed everything. If you've ever sensed something slightly misaligned in your life, a subtle emotional gap you couldn't explain, I want you to know this. Not every quiet discomfort is overthinking. Sometimes it's intuition waiting for data. The strength isn't in exploding when you find it. It's in staying composed enough to let the truth settle before you decide what it means. So now I'll ask you something honestly. If you discovered tomorrow that the story you believed about your own identity wasn't entirely true, would you confront it immediately? Or would you prepare yourself first? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge, they're about recalibration.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.